Geico knows there are many reasons why you ride. From the exciting adventure of the daily commute to the peace of mind that Geico always has your back with 24/7 access to claim service and legendary customer service. But Pamela Mund had one reason in particular.
My skin is extremely averse to most fabrics, except for the soft, buttery feeling of leather. Thankfully, I found my clan of leather lovers in the biking community. It's been life-changing.
Geico Motorcycle. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
To show you how easy it is to file a claim with Geico, we hired a soap opera star.
Gracious me, my car has storm damage and I've had to file a claim. Could it possibly get worse? Will my claims team leave me for someone else? Someone less intense?
No. Actually, when you file a claim with Geico, you get your own dedicated claims team who promises to stay with you throughout the process.
Oh, I've never known such loyalty. I can't wait for the second season.
Geico. Great service without all the drama.
Good afternoon. Would you like to try a free sample of our double fudge brownie?
Oh, sure. That's very good. I'll just take one more, just to be sure. Yep, still very good.
Some things never change. Like never being able to take just one free sample. And Geico saving folks lots of money on their car insurance.
Is that macadamia nut I taste? Let me take one more.
Sir,
Yeah, I thought so.
15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
What's evicting my people who didn't want to die serving lattes to anti-mask activists?
That's actually one of your best intros. I was like, where are you going? And I was like, oh no, there, pulled it off. Great job.
So this is It Could Happen Here. It's a show about collapse. And speaking of collapse, the Supreme Court just issued a shadow ruling, which we should probably do a whole episode about this practice of like Supreme Court decisions that are, it was a Supreme Court decision that was not a Supreme Court decision. So they don't have to issue like a whole justification. They don't have to like explain where everyone landed. They just said, hey, you know, the eviction moratoriums that the Biden administration just pushed through again, nuh-uh. It's not constitutional. We're not going to say anymore. Start kicking people out of their motherfucking homes. And boy, how did that process have started. And we don't know. I mean, I think you'll get very different numbers when you try to figure out like how many people are going to get evicted or at risk of being evicted. Like the highest you'll hear is like 30 to 40 million Americans at risk of eviction. I think it was Bank of America's numbers that anticipated as many as 750,000 households.
I think it was Goldman.
Oh, was it Goldman? Goldman Sachs.
Goldman Sachs' numbers.
Anticipated about 750,000 American households losing their homes, and that's obviously more than 750,000 people. Now, when we talk about like how many of those folks could end up homeless, it's going to be a less than that total number of households, because whenever you have stuff like this happen, like in 2008, a decent number of people who lose access to their homes wind up kind of couch surfing, bunking with family. You wind up with 2 or 3 families in one home, which is obviously particularly a problem during a pandemic, right? Like if you have families doubling or tripling up in the same house while there's a plague, that introduces additional complications. But it's possible, in fact, very likely, because about the kind of conservative estimate for the number of people who are homeless on American streets right now is a little over 550,000. So there's a pretty good chance that the number of homeless could essentially double in the next, not quite overnight, because evictions, it's not like a thing where like, okay, the Supreme Court said you can evict people now, everybody's out on their ass the next day. It's a process of evicting people. There is like a legal process, but in the near future, we could see a doubling of the number of Americans who are without homes, if not even potentially more than that. So it's pretty high stakes, which I think necessitates everybody be thinking about not just ways to fight the Supreme Court ruling or whatever, not just ways to get the government to provide support to people, but also eviction defense. Because kind of historically, and today we're going to kind of give a little bit of a historic overview here. Historically, eviction defense has not in American history solved the overall problems, but it can provide necessary, it can be a necessary like tourniquet for a lot of people and for communities before kind of more long-term solutions to these problems get brought up. And I think it behooves us to talk about eviction defense kind of from that standpoint. So I found a really interesting article when you start reading about eviction defense. A lot of the eviction defense like articles, kind of talking about the Great Depression, are going to come from the International Socialist Review or other kind of socialist or outright communist like websites. And there's some good reasons for this, which is that the organizations during the Great Depression who were doing most of the anti-eviction organizing were communist organizations. Now, I found some kind of scholarly analyses of some of the reporting on that will point out that they, especially if you're kind of like if you're studying eviction defense based on kind of the documents at the time, and it was a lot of like socialist worker and unemployed citizen and whatnot, newspapers with titles like that. A lot of those would kind of tend to deliberately undercount the efforts of non-communist anti-eviction organizations because there was a whole political fight going on then. So keep that in mind. That said, it is kind of worth reading some of these accounts. And I think one that is particularly noteworthy is what happened in New York City starting in 1931, 1932. And this was in the Bronx, Park East and Allerton Avenue. And it started, obviously, like the Great Depression kicks off like 1930, 1931. By January of 1932, you've got a huge number of people unemployed and increasingly desperate, and you've got these landlords trying to evict and kick them out. And the communists in the Bronx started an eviction defense network that was very noteworthy. And it initially crystallized around this series of communist co-ops, which were these two buildings in the Bronx that were populated by communists. And that had included like a cooperative housing experiment, like some cooperative gardening, that sort of stuff. And they were mostly Eastern European Jewish like workers, like people who had come over from Europe, and in a lot of cases had been socialist activists in Europe, many of whom had to flee Europe to the United States because of their activism. And in January of 1932, they organized rent strikes at three large apartment buildings at Bronx East Park. And one of the things that they created was what they called the Upper Bronx Unemployed Council. And this kind of was part of a series of decisions that led to like the creation of an organization called the Unemployed Citizens Committees, I think is what they called them. And kind of one of the ideas there was to point out that, you know, despite kind of the focus within the capitalist system on people needing to have a job, needing to make income in order to be like citizens, unemployed people were citizens too, and imbued with like the full rights of an American citizen. And so they were kind of taking ownership of the term unemployed rather than accepting it as a slur. That like, no, we're still citizens and we have rights and power, and we'll organize in order to enact our power on, or in order to kind of forcefully try to make the changes that we need. And so these communists in the Bronx organized 3 buildings worth of tenants into a rent strike. They were refusing to pay rent until they got their demands, which were a 15% reduction in rent, an end to eviction, repairs in apartments, and recognition of the tenants committee as an official bargaining agent. So they were trying to effectively unionize, like in the same way that workers had, just for tenants in a building. Now, this rent strike set off a rent riot that eventually more than 4,000 people participated in. City marshals, and the marshals were the people the city would hire to force homeless people out of their houses. Marshals and police showed up to evict 17 tenants, and about 4,000 people showed up to oppose them, and that started this massive street fight. And it was largely... And this would be the case with most of these rent strikes in the early 30s. It was largely women who would do most of the fighting and who would do most of the actual like physical organizing against the police. And some of this was because they recognized that like when their men were there, the cops would beat the shit out of them and arrest them. And so there was a lot of times where they were like, okay, you guys get out of the house. Like the women are going to organize. We'll get up on the fire escapes and the balconies. We'll throw shit at the cops, you know? And these were also very like, and I don't want to like be ignoring this either. These were extremely communist events. Like they would be singing communist songs. They would be like carrying out communist chants. It was communist papers that did a lot of the organizing. I want to read a quote from that International Socialist Review article that I found, kind of like laying out how this particular strike went. Quote, Bronx property owners moved quickly to try to contain the movement. At first, they tried arbitration. Following the evictions at 665 Allerton, landlords in Bronx Park East asked a Blue Ribbon Committee of Bronx Jewish leaders to arbitrate the dispute, convinced that an impartial examination of the building's books would show that the landlord could not meet the strikers' demands without operating at a loss. But the strike leaders contemptuously rejected arbitration, and indeed the whole notion that a reasonable return on one's investment represented a basis for negotiation. When times were good, strike leader Max Kamowitz declared, the landlords didn't offer to share their profits with us. The landlords made enough money off us when we had it. Now that we haven't got it, the landlords must be satisfied with less. Faced with this kind of bargaining position, landlords felt they had no choice but to pull out the stops to suppress the movement. By the second week of February 1932, two major organizations of Bronx landlords had formed rent strike committees that offered unlimited funding and legal support for any landlord facing a communist-led rent strike. Using the considerable political influence and legal expertise at their disposal, they developed a strategy that included wholesale issuance of dispossess notices against striking tenants, efforts to win injunctions against picketing and strikes, agreements by judges to waive normal delay periods and evictions, and efforts to ban rent strikes by legislative enactment. The situation has become much graver than most persons suppose, one landlord spokesman declared. The strikes are spreading rapidly, and scores of landlords are facing financial ruin or loss of their properties as a result of them. Former State Senator Benjamin Anton told landlords, "This is a peculiar neighborhood. It is the hotbed of communism and radicalism. The people in this neighborhood are mostly communists and Soviet sympathizers. They do not believe in our form of government." Now, what are the things that's interesting about this? So in a lot of cases, particularly there was like this first big set of riots that kind of ended when the police kind of pushed the rioters back, but because of how many of them there were, they came to an agreement, and like the landlords gave concessions to the people in those three buildings. But the next set of strikes were pretty much crushed, and the majority of the rent strikes, they start popping up in buildings kind of all around this part of New York in the period. They don't win the initial strike. By which I mean people get evicted. The marshals come in, they take these people's furniture out. But what the communists started doing, because they had the numbers, is they would show up after the cops and the marshals left, and they would lift, put together pulley systems and lift people's furniture back into their apartments and move them back in. And so part of the understanding was it costs the city money every time they send marshals out, because the city was paying to evict people. So we'll just move them back in after they're evicted, and that's going to like make the situation untenable for the city. So that led to the police setting up like temporary police stations outside of some of the buildings that were like most active as part of a long-term solution to try to suppress the revolt. The one issue of the Daily Worker noted, quote, "Cops patrol the street all day. The entire territory is under semi-martial law. People are driven around the streets, off the corners, and away from the houses." And so, yeah, it kind of this went on for weeks. And there's one of the criticisms that even this International Socialist Review write-up I found will make of the initial rent strike is that because kind of a lot of the hardcore communist activists came to relish sort of these clashes with police as a result of the evictions and had this belief that they would radicalize the masses. Whereas there was, I think, among the masses more of like we mostly don't want to lose our homes. And when you hit this, they kind of hit this wall where they would come out and fight the cops, but the cops would win and push people out in the end, and the evictions would still happen. And it kind of led to this kind of loss of momentum within the movement. And that didn't change until the communists kind of altered their organizing strategy. And so they started mobilizing all of the different sort of left-wing networks that were in the area to not just do eviction resistance, but to picket rent-striking buildings, to hold street rallies and protest marches. When a protester was killed by the police, they got like 50,000 people out in the streets. And it was this matter of, number one, keeping huge numbers of people in the streets, which is, expensive for the city, was bad for business in a lot of cases. But they also started organizing unemployed people into kind of a quasi-union sort of situation that didn't just organize stuff on the street, but started reaching out to the government because this is right around the time that the Roosevelt administration started pushing protections, including like eviction protections and like funding to help people stay in their houses. And that was kind of, you could argue like a lot of those protections came about as a result of all of the people who were doing eviction resistance on the street. But these unemployed councils, they called them, would basically help people go to the government, help people like file for benefits, help people stay in their houses. And kind of in the end, through a variety of different tactics, they were really successful in stopping large numbers of people from being dispossessed and keeping a lot of these communities together. And the home relief bureaus, which is kind of the government agencies that were formed from like the emergency funding here, worked with the unemployed councils to keep people in their homes. So it was this, you saw this situation where you had, it's what started with kind of like physical force confronting the eviction teams and confronting the police. And that helped to organize and galvanize people, but it had its limitations. And that eventually evolved into a broader sort of series of strikes and marches that were disruptive enough to life that they in the city that they helped to provide kind of impetus for government benefits to keep people in their homes. And then once those benefits were there, a lot of these organizations kind of pivoted towards helping people like file and get benefits in order to keep them in their homes. And in the end of it, it was just kind of this very multifaceted movement that had its missteps and went through a variety of tactics over time, but in the end was largely successful in keeping communities from being forced out of their homes. And I don't know, I think it's an interesting story. And it's kind of, you see when you hear eviction events talked about, people tend to kind of hone in on just the big fights against the police, which were clearly important, or they tend to hone in on stuff that happened elsewhere in the country, like organizations of farmers and sharecroppers who would show up in eviction courts and like threaten police and stop, sheriffs from evicting widows from their homes and whatnot. And these are important stories. But I think the broader story about like why these eviction resistance networks functioned was that they pivoted regularly. They didn't just stick with, we're going to fight the cops when they try to evict people. They formed these unemployed councils. And these unemployed councils were communist organizations, but you didn't have to be a communist to join or to benefit from them. And they would, lobby the government on behalf of these people. They would help them get benefits. And in the end, all of this was really successful in, what was the most important battle, which was keeping families in their homes. So I don't know. That's kind of like the we'll include a couple of links in here, but that's kind of the overall story of what happened in particularly in New York in the 30s, which was kind of the best documented series of eviction resistance movements. Yeah. Quick break. Go pee and then continue peeing because you can pee and listen to a podcast.
Must
Ain't no
be
God.
nice.
Looking to build wealth beyond the stock market? Gain access to alternative investment opportunities once reserved for the ultra-wealthy with Yield Street. Build a diversified portfolio with investments such as real estate, art, commercial finance, and other alternatives typically with low stock market correlation and targeting annual yields of up to 15%. Yield Street investment minimums start at $1,000. Head to yieldstreet.com to join over 275,000 members and create your account today.
Geico knows there are many reasons why you ride. From the exciting adventure of the daily commute to the peace of mind that Geico always has your back with 24/7 access to claim service and legendary customer service. But Pamela Mund had one reason in particular.
My skin is extremely averse to most fabrics, except for the soft, buttery feeling of leather. Thankfully, I found my clan of leather lovers in the biking community. It's been life-changing.
Geico Motorcycle. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
To show you how easy it is to file a claim with Geico, we hired a soap opera star.
Gracious me, my car has storm damage and I've had to file a claim. Could it possibly get worse? Will my claims team leave me for someone else? Someone less intense?
No. Actually, when you file a claim with Geico, you get your own dedicated claims team who promises to stay with you throughout the process.
Oh, I've never known such loyalty. I can't wait for the second season.
Geico. Great service without all the drama.
We're back. And before I move on to Chris's, I wanted to make a note that I've come across a couple of times in the readings that I found that like kind of talk about eviction resistance in the 30s, but within the context of either what was happening in 2008 after the financial crash or what's happening now, which is that evictions are way more common now than they ever were during the Great Depression, both as a percentage of workers and in absolute numbers. It is enormously common. And in one of the statistics I found in a New Yorker article about the eviction epidemic is that in Milwaukee, a city which has about 105,000 renter households, landlords legally evict roughly 16,000 adults and children every year. And that's like, that is a significantly higher rate than they were dealing in this period. And because evictions are so commonplace, they don't really attract much attention. One of the reasons why those early eviction defense networks were able to get so many people out in the streets is that the idea that families would be evicted, particularly in any kind of significant numbers, was fairly new. And so it drew a lot of attention. People were outraged. Whereas today, it's something that happens all the time. And it's something that a significant amount of infrastructure has been built up to allow evictions. So there are full-time sheriff squads in large cities whose only job is to carry out eviction and foreclosure orders. There are moving companies that specialize in just evictions, and the crews for these companies work all day long, 5 days a week. There's so much of this going on in every major city in the country that there's a significant amount of you're not just competing with these kind of ad hoc teams of marshals and cops showing up to like pile furniture out on the street. You're dealing with years worth of infrastructure to enable evictions. So yeah, that sucks. Anyway, Chris, why don't you go on?
Okay. One thing I will say though is that still even to this day, like the landlords rely heavily on people self-evicting. People just sort of you had an eviction notice, people just leave. Right. And so they do not, even with all the sort of capacity they built up, they don't actually have the ability to, like, if literally every tenant, I mean, people, a lot of tenants have started showing up in court. Like, it would be genuinely difficult for them to actually evict every single person, like, by force, even with the infrastructure they've built up. Mm-hmm. But, I would talk about, before I go into some more resistance examples, sort of how we got here, which is, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the 70s and 80s that are sort of important to this. On a sort of macroeconomic level, it seems all the way out. For the 70s and 80s, there's this enormous economic sort of collapse. There's all these economic problems. There's massive inflation, and one of the big things that's happening here is that sort of profit rates in manufacturing are collapsing. It's like, okay, well, what does it have to do with housing? Well, what it has to do with housing is that we'll zoom in on Japan for a second, because like the U.S. sort of just like guts Japan's manufacturing economy in the 80s through some sort of complicated currency stuff. But Japan's solution to this is interesting. They're like, okay, so our manufacturing sector is in ruins. How do we maintain the economy? What if we just give a bunch of credit, very cheap credit, to banks and let them buy houses? And so they do, and the Japanese government's assumption is, well, they'll buy houses and they'll buy houses and they'll buy stocks, and the value of those assets will just keep increasing. Nothing will ever go wrong with this. Maybe like 8 years later, you get the East Asian bubble collapsing, and that's a big part of what that was. But the important part about this for us is that, so in order to save Japan, right, the U.S. government guts its own manufacturing sector, and so this means in the 90s. You have Clinton going, okay, how are we going to save the economy? And Clinton looks at the Japanese model and was like, wait, no, hold on, we can do this too. And so, the first collapse this causes, Clinton gives the banks a bunch of cheap credit. They buy stocks with it. They give like us a bunch of cheap credit, and, we buy houses and we buy stocks with it. And then, the tech bubble implodes. And then this all leads to 2008, where, all of the sort of, all of the bad mortgages the banks have been passing out just implode, and a couple of banks go under. By a couple of, like 3 banks go under, but the ones who survive suddenly, there's all these foreclosed houses, and they just start buying them up. And I mean, part of the story is Obama just starts this thing called a robo signing, where they just start signing like foreclosure notices on just random houses, like people who were keeping up on their payments. They just take their houses, like tens of thousands of these houses just get taken and give them back to the banks. And this is, this is how the banks recovered from 2008 is they just stole a bunch of people's houses at gunpoint. And what you see from there, and this is the sort of long range trend that's been happening in the economy since about, since the 70s and the 80s is that, okay, so the sort of the institutional investors, people with a bunch of money, they can't get returns from manufacturing anymore in the way they used to. So instead, they're like, okay, what if instead of making money by making things, we just take the money from you at gunpoint and we invest in, we build an enormous police force and we buy everyone's houses. And now, there's, this is how we get to a situation that's even worse than what was happening in the 30s, which is that enormous portions of the world economy are just completely dependent on these banks and these sort of giant landlord firms owning these buildings and then, putting a gun to your head and saying, hey, you're going to give us money. And if you don't give us money, you lose your home. There are periods where people mount sort of effective resistances to this. One of them is in Spain after 2008, Spain is one of the countries worst hit by the whole sort of collapse. And, so enormous number of people get evicted, but they realize that, there's just a bunch of these houses that are just sitting there empty. And so, very slowly, and it's sort of accelerating after 2008, 2011, people start just squatting in them. And, and a lot of some of these people, a lot of times they're going back to the homes that the banks had taken from them. And, they form these, basically they form these enormous, I guess you could call they're part squatter organizations, part anti-eviction organizations. And what they're basically able to do is they can, the biggest one is called PAH. And what they're basically able to do is they can get enough people together that when the police show up for an eviction, they can bring 5,000, 6,000 people. And this makes it almost impossible, unless the police can specifically isolate one squat that doesn't have community support. It becomes almost impossible to evict people. And so they have these, there's and they lose some battles, they win some battles, but they're able to hold because they have these sort of enormous organizations of people who are squatting, and then they have a bunch of community support. They have support, and this is something I think talking about how the sort of communist strategy works in the 30s. This is something that we're going to see with a lot of these is that the renters, a bunch of renters, or a bunch of people who are squatting in houses, a bunch of people who are trying to do eviction defense because they're being evicted. There's kind of a limit to what they can do on their own to some extent, and the way that they start winning is when they're able to sort of, when they stop fighting landlords individually, and B, and you start getting these large organizations. And the second thing that changes is when they're able to bring in the rest of the community. And so one of the another sort of example of this is in 2017. It really from about 2016, 2017 across North America, you start to see a sort of resurgence of tenant organizing. And one of the most sort of famous examples is Parkdale, which is it's a place in Toronto. And in Parkdale, a whole bunch, several hundred tenants in across a bunch of buildings, organizing for a long time, and eventually, they keep getting rent increases, and a bunch of these people are in danger of losing their homes because they can't afford them anymore, and so they start doing rent strikes, and they start going from building to building to building, and they're not fighting the cops as much as sort of the communists were. A lot of what they do is, so a lot of people, Parkdale is a working class community, right? It's also a largely immigrant community. And, it's sort of rapidly being gentrified, but, a lot of people who are in these, a lot of the tenants are people who, had been in labor actions, right? Had been in strikes, had been in sort of other kinds of labor organizing. And so they're able to pull together, and they're able also to, importantly, they bring in a bunch of the teachers at the local elementary school, because a bunch of the buildings that they're striking in that are owned by these landlords are right around an elementary school, and the teachers who teach in these schools are they're also seeing the effects of these kids losing their family, like, you know, the kids losing their houses, kids just disappearing because they lost their houses, kids dealing with these financial struggles. And so they, you know, the teachers start backing them, and you start getting this bunch of community support, and they're able to basically to force the landlords to negotiate. And they get a settlement that's like, the way they describe it, there's a really good documentary about this called called This Is Parkdale. And, you know, the way to describe it is that the deal they got from all this organizing, all these rent strikes was so good that the government, the company put a gag order on them so they can't talk about the numbers. Right before the pandemic started, I think some people probably have heard of this. There was a group called Moms for Housing that was in Oakland that, you know, had taken back houses that had been taken, you know, by the banks that were just sitting there empty. And, you know, at the very beginning of 2020, like, the police show up with tanks. They show up with, you know, like full riot police stuff. But it's like, yeah, like they're, you know, and the moms are sort of like driven from the house. And this starts, you know, this is a continuation of this whole sort of battle they've been having with the landlords and with the city over it. And eventually, you know, they're not able to physically retake the building, but they're able to put so much pressure on the city that the landlord company is basically forced to sell the house to a community land trust, which is one of the other solutions people have sort of come up and try to deal with this crisis more broadly, which is that, you know, instead of having buildings that are like owned by landlords, and so, you know, the reason they have this property is to make money from you, and they kick you out if they can't make enough money. You have, you know, you have these buildings be owned by the community instead, and, you know, and this has been, I mean, there's limits to it. Like, you need to have enough money to actually be able to like buy these buildings. But, you know, that's one of the other things that's been, you know, being done to sort of fight this crisis, is by having the communities themselves just directly take control of the buildings.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back to hear from Garrison.
Well,
Right,
so when
Robert?
did Sophie become the president of transitions?
I've always been the president.
Why do you? Okay, well, here's ads.
"15 minutes could save you 15% or more."
Is that Shakespeare?
Nope, it's Geico.
Yeah, that's Shakespeare from one of his unpublished works. Oh, it be not for awakening. Nay, giveth thou the berries. For 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
No, it's from Geico, because they help save people money.
Well, I hate to break it to you, but Geico got it from Shakespeare.
Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
Good afternoon. Would you like to try a free sample of our double fudge brownie?
Oh, sure. That's very good. I'll just take one more, just to be sure. Yep, still very good.
Some things never change. Like never being able to take just one free sample. And Geico saving folks lots of money on their car insurance.
Is that macadamia nut I taste? Let me take one more.
Sir.
Yeah, I thought so.
15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
Okay, audience, do you love trivia? Do you love the hit podcast, Stuff You Should Know? Then you'll love the new Trivial Pursuit game, Stuff You Should Know Edition. With 600 questions from the hugely popular Stuff You Should Know podcast, this game is packed with weird and unbelievable trivia inspired by topics on the show. You'll be challenged by brain-busting questions in 6 fascinating categories, including myths, legends, and conspiracies. And SYSK selects a mix of topics handpicked by podcast hosts Josh and Chuck. It's perfect for 3 to 6 players and adults from ages 16 to 116. If you love the Stuff You Should Know podcast, or you're just curious about the world, grab your copy of the Trivial Pursuit game, Stuff You Should Know Edition today, wherever you get your favorite board games.
All right, we're back, and we're going to hear from Garrison last.
So I'm going to be bringing up one of the more recent kind of cases of eviction defense that captured a bit of national media attention. This was back in December of 2020 with the Red House in Portland, kind of riding off the trails of the 2020 BLM protests. This kind of had the inertia to keep this situation active with people, willing to kind of do the thing where you actually go out and fight the cops. Although that did not happen tons with this situation. A brief overview of what happened. So there was this family who's been in who's owned this specific home for like over 50 years. And in the 2000s, they ran into a series of financial hardships. They took out some kind of predatory loans. And they kept running into problems with their home. They tried to have one of their sons do like litigation, but he was like a sovereign citizen type person, and it made things kind of worse. And it wasn't really ideal. But that all of that is like a part of this. But the important part for everyone who decided to actually show up was like, this was like during like November and December when the plague was like the worst it was ever at, and
except for right now.
Except for there was no vaccinated people in November, right? It was like the death rates were like super high.
That was.
So, and that's when the cops decided to evict this family. The other side of this is that the company that technically like bought the house from the banks is also a pretty shady developer company.
So there's
it sure was.
Yeah, so there was a lot of like weird stuff.
It was. Are you going to go into?
You can go into that.
Yeah. So basically, just for an example of how shady it is, it was some. When the national attention started, they immediately backed out of wanting to take the house in such a way that, because of kind of some of the connections with people involved, everyone's like, oh, it was an organized crime thing. Like, it was a criminal enterprise. They got attention. We're like, well, this is not worth it. We don't want anybody looking in on our shit. We're just giving up right away.
It was a very very sketchy company / person had bought the house from the bank, which the bank took it from this family. But so anyway, in like from September to December, the cops kept trying to kick the people out of this home. Sometimes they did, and then sometimes the people just like went back. And this kind of all culminated around like December 5th, I think, is the date that cops really tried to like go in there with like rifles, riot gear, and like drag people out. And even though it was super early in the morning, a lot of like the people who had been protesting for like BLM in Portland all showed up really quickly, and they chased the cops away. And then everyone got super tense because they just chased away like 20. I think it was mostly sheriffs, I believe. And yeah, so then they did what everyone in Portland does: is just build barricades, which is.
For some context on this, Portlanders had been building barricades for months, generally to no effect. Like, it would be like there would be a moving protest, somebody would throw a barricade in the street, and the police would immediately shove it aside. But this time it worked.
This time it absolutely worked.
This time it worked like gangbusters.
They built very thick barricades over like 5 different sides of this house, because like this house is like in the middle of a city block. It's a super interesting property that just like sits in the middle of a street. So they built barricades all around this whole section of this neighborhood. They had caltrops. They had like spikes.
Caltrops are spiky balls, basically, that are meant to fuck up generally tires, but you don't want to step on them either.
They also had I think they're called They're called check hedgehogs. They're basically kind of like caltrops but giant, and they're meant to like mess up the undercarriage of a vehicle, make it hard for vehicles to plow through. So we had these. There was all this, all these kind of impromptu weapons. There was like behind all the barricades, people like lined up like bottles and eggs to like help to just throw at people if they tried to enter.
And rocks, lots of rocks.
There was various projectiles like just like laid out behind all these barricades, but the barricades were thick. They actually had like multiple layers. And they had like binding to keep them together. It would have been difficult to get through the barricades. You would have needed
a couple hundred people and heavy equipment.
Yeah.
Especially if if they weren't manned, obviously you could just walk through. But if the barricades had been manned, it would have been an intense effort in order to force your way through them.
So yeah, within a few hours, these barricades started to come up, and they kept growing over the course of a week. And there was always anywhere between 50 to 100 people camping out in this spot. Sometimes even more people. There was multiple kitchens got set up. People tried to they tried to do COVID safe protocols in certain areas. And yeah, it became this relatively complicated network of people rotating shifts, manning different spots to always make sure people are watching all the different entrances. And basically this lasted for over a week. The mayor was very pissed. He was not thrilled that this situation was happening, because one, it made the sheriffs look bad, and two, it made the protesters actually look effective.
Yep.
And now, like all of these things, we've talked about this before. There's always runs into problems with sorts of things. They're never perfect. There was instances of people who appointed themselves security.
Oh God, yeah.
Doing attacking people for doing graffiti on random walls of pavement in other apartment buildings or whatever. So there was problems specifically around security. But that happens in a lot of these things, and that's kind of worth discussing on a whole nother episode. And there were attempts from fascists, like street fascists, not cops, to attack the barricades, and they didn't really succeed because there were just so many people there. So that was kind of what happened. Now, people didn't know what the end game was for this type of thing, right? Because we're just they're just doing this thing where we don't know how long this is gonna last. But as this was happening, other people were setting up GoFundMes to raise money for the family, and eventually the kind of idea that was decided on by the family and a few other people involved was what if we can just get enough money to actually buy the house back? And after a week and a half, they raised I think $315,000 was the number. And because the developer was so shady, he like Robert said, he backed down immediately. He's no, yeah. we can find some other solution to this. Yeah. Just stop talking about it.
Just please stop talking about me and my business.
So
which I have to say, we said probably an organized crime thing. I prefer this guy and whatever he's doing 1,000 times to a bank.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the result, is that the family made a deal with both the city and this developer that they would try to basically use some of the fundraised money to buy back this spot. But this would have been totally impossible if it weren't for the militant display of defense that activists deployed in this street in Portland. Because there was a lot of the Portlandia liberal Portlanders weren't happy with this. So a lot of people wanted this situation ended. So as soon as this thing became a possibility, the mayor was quick to jump on this as a way to stop this from happening. Because they did not want this to continue, and because it would have been pretty difficult for the cops to push through. It would have turned into quite the shit show.
And there's, I think, two really important takeaways in terms of why it was able to succeed. And I think most of the ultimate success of it was resultant on the first 24 hours, really even maybe the first 12, because once the sheriffs tried their first push and got pushed out, if they had done what generally happened in protests, which is, sometimes you would have a push where the cops would back off, they would bring in more forces. And if they had in an hour or two, they probably could have cleared people out and done the eviction. But they were so surprised, and the fact that it had happened in broad daylight was a big factor. It was kind of early in the morning when this kicked off, that they didn't come back. And so immediately people started bringing more folks in. Within 6 hours or so, there were pretty potent barricades. By the time night fell, they were significant already, and they by the time I got there that night, it was already too much to easily handle.
Yeah.
And because of what happened in that first 12 hours, by the time the city kind of had adapted to what was happening, it was already a huge story. the level of defensive infrastructure was massive. Like it was because of how quickly people came together and got barricades down that they were able to get the police off balance. We talk a lot about the OODA loop, right? About how you kind of disrupt an opponent. And it is about stopping them from making a decision, right? And so step one was kind of, once they forced the police out, there was something of a blackout about like what was, like, people would talk about what was going on, but there wasn't a lot of footage from inside or video from inside. So it stopped the cops from observing as well as they might otherwise have. And of course they couldn't physically observe because they were blocked out of the area. They weren't able to kind of, because of how quickly the media around it drummed up, they weren't able to sort of orient a response, find a way to villainize the protesters easily. There were attempts made after that to attack them personally, like the family in the house personally, but they didn't get on that quickly. And overall, because of how quickly things developed and how quickly it got much larger than they were prepared to deal with, they were not able to decide and act in a timely fashion. And that left kind of the momentum on the side of the protesters, and ultimately they were successful as a result of that. And I think if you're trying to study what about Red House is replicable, you know, there's a lot of barricade tactics and stuff, but a big part of it is just the speed with which people took action and how that pushed the city and the police off balance and allowed a victory.
Yeah, so you know the city, the developer, and the family made a deal that if the barricades came down, the cops won't mess with them, as this process of signing over the house and doing like financial stuff would go on, and that is still an ongoing process. That's still something that's still being dealt with, but the cops haven't messed with the property since December 5th. So that is you know. And this isn't a perfectly reputable. This isn't a perfectly like you can't replicate this specific strategy always. Like, you know, it's not always possible to raise $250,000 to buy back a property. You know, because especially if you're renting, you know, there's all these things that can't be replicated exactly. But the general idea of very quick, sudden mobilization that catches powers at B off guard is something that can be useful in a lot of different scenarios, right? It's so the kind of the reason, because basically the barricades and the fast mobilization created more options. So if you want to create more options, this is something that can do that, right? This is something that can put more things on the table. It may not be the same result, but there's going to be other things that could happen.
And I think the other thing that's important here, you know, the Red House is sort of interesting because the cops, to some extent, were expecting resistance. They just weren't expecting this much. But, you know, again, like as we were saying earlier, landlords like are basically relying to a very large extent on people evicting themselves, right? They're not expecting resistance, and this is why, you know, like this is why it tends to be. You know, if you do one of these things, you get this like one enormous police response, right? Like, you know, they show up in Oakland, they show up with tanks, right? And the reason they do that is because, you know, what they can do is they can make an example out of people, right? But they can't actually stop everyone, right? Like they're not equipped for, you know, dealing with 3 million people just saying no. And so, you know, if you organize fast enough and if you catch them by surprise, and, you know, if you bring the stuff that they're doing like to light, like, you know, you show up to their houses, you show up to the banks, you show up to their offices, right? Like they're not, you know, and you keep going, right? They're not expecting this, they're not prepared for it, and you know, there's all this in part deal, like they'll lose, right? Like they will, a lot of times, like they will negotiate, they will settle, they will not evict you, like in order basically to, you know, deal with all of the attention, the fact that they can't drive you out.
Yeah. All right, and I think that's going to call it a day for us here at It Could Happen Here, the podcast that is this one. So go out and, I don't know, eat an entire 737 piece by piece, or do something else. Goodbye.
You can follow us at Happen Here Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and at Cool
That's
Media
allegedly.
Instagram and
Allegedly,
I'm
Sophie.
too tired. Bye, everybody.
It Could Happen Here is a production of Cool Zone Media. For more podcasts from Cool Zone Media, visit our website, coolzonemedia.com, or check us out on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find sources for It Could Happen Here updated monthly at coolzonemedia.com/sources. And just as a heads up, we'll be back next week on Tuesday instead of Monday, as we'll be taking the day off for Labor Day by not laboring. So catch up on an old episode or cleanse yourself of our voices.
I want to get back to kissing the cheeks of my grandbabies, making Sunday dinner with a house full of family and lots of laughs.
COVID-19 has changed how we live and how we feel. But now, there are vaccines. And they are the very first step that let us get back to what we miss most. It's okay to have questions.
Is it safe?
Should I wait? Now, get the facts. Visit getvaccineanswers.org so you can make an informed decision when vaccines are available to you. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
If you love trivia, if you love the hugely popular Stuff You Should Know podcast, then the Trivial Pursuit game, Stuff You Should Know edition, is for you. With 600 questions, weird and unbelievable trivia in categories like myths, legends, and conspiracies. SYSK selects a mix of topics handpicked by podcast hosts Josh and Chuck. Get the Trivial Pursuit game, Stuff You Should Know edition today, wherever you get your favorite board game.
The stories that are affecting the Black community are being covered on the Black Information Network. Not a show or a podcast, BIN is a 24/7 news network covering stories from a Black perspective. Listen to the Black Information Network on the iHeartRadio app and get news for and by the Black community. Anywhere, anytime. Keeping you informed, keeping you engaged. The Black Information Network and BINnews.com.